Hello, today I want to experiment 20 watercolor techniques with you. We will see how different techniques turned out so you can apply them to your painting later on. Let's dive in. I use masking tape to separate a paper sheet into 10 rectangles. I have 2 paper sheets, so we will have 20 rectangles to test different techniques. The first technique is wet in wet, or also called wet on wet painting technique, and this is the most basic watercolor techniques for everyone to try. So to use this technique, we will need to wet the paper first with clean water, and after that we will need to paint wet colors onto the wet paper, so the pigments will have a chance to flow in their way on the surface of the paper, creating beautiful patterns. Now we move on to the wet on dry technique. To use this technique, we can simply use a brush to get some wet paint from your palette and then paint on the dry paper. So with the wet on dry technique, you can get sharp edges and paint small details. Now you can see the different effects when we use the wet on wet and wet on dry techniques. The third technique is called dry brush. So I'm using a dry brush, an angle brush, and then I pick some colors, the wet color, not too wet, and then after that I apply to the paper. So this technique will add more textures to your painting. When you want to paint branches or surface of the ocean when it reflects the sunlight. The next one is called glazing. The glazing technique involves layering colors on top of each other. Because watercolor is transparent and you can see the previous layer through the new layer. The key thing in glazing colors is to wait for the previous layer to dry completely before you apply a new layer. I'm using a round brush to get some blue color and then paint wet on dry onto the paper. And now the blue dot is already dry. I'm gonna add the pink color on top of that, and it will overlap the blue dot a little bit so you can see how the layers overlap each other. You can see that when two layers overlap each other, they create the new color, which is a little bit purple. Alright, we will move on to the next technique, which is called splattering. Splattering colors is a very fun technique to try, and this can add motion to your painting and make it more dynamic. To splatter colors, you will need to cover some objects, important objects first with maybe tissue paper. So now I'm using tissue paper to cover other parts of my paper sheet. You can use different brushes for this technique, for example the fan brush or an old toothbrush. I really like using an old toothbrush for this technique because it's just so effective. So I get some color from the palette, add some water into it so it will not be too dry, and then I use the end of the other brush to move along the bristles of the toothbrush. So now you can see that some colors are splattered to the paper, and I just want to make it more colorful, so I add some green colors as well. So you need to make sure that the paint has some water in it, otherwise it won't be too thick and it cannot be splattered. The next technique I'm going to introduce you is the masking technique. So you can use a masking tape or masking fluid for this technique. And this technique is very useful when you want to keep some highlights white on your painting. To use the masking fluid, you can use an old brush to get some masking fluid and then draw onto the paper. Remember that when you use the brush to get the fluid, then later on you cannot use the brush anymore. So that's why I suggested you using an old brush instead. So I'm drawing a heart, and so I want to keep this part white before I paint other colors for the background. You need to allow the masking fluid to dry completely before you add the colors, because the colors won't have water in it. If the masking fluid is still wet, it's not gonna work and it's gonna damage your painting. So now the masking fluid is already dry, I'm adding my colors onto the paper and using the wet on wet technique. So I try to add more than one color to the painting. We need to wait for the paper to dry 100% before we can remove the masking fluid. So I'm using an eraser to just remove the masking fluid, and you can see that the area where we put the masking fluid on top of it is now revealed, and it remains the white color from the paper. Next, we are going to create a flat wash. A flat wash is a flat base of one color with the same consistency. So creating washes is one of the basic techniques that I would recommend any beginner to practice and master first before trying more fancy techniques later on. No matter whether your painting is small or big, you will need to create washes. So the next wash that we are going to create is a graded wash, or also called gradient wash. So the difference between a flat wash and a gradient wash is the consistency of the color decreases after each brush stroke in the gradient wash. So you need to, after the first brush stroke, you will need to get some water from your water jar and then add some colors. So now the color in your brush will have less pigment, so it will be lighter than the first brush stroke. So if you paint flowers or a gradient sky, you might want to consider the graded wash. The last wash that we can create is called variegated wash. So similar to the graded wash, but the variegated wash looks like a spectrum of two colors. So to create a variegated wash, we will create two graded wash of two colors, starting from two sides of the spectrum and grading towards the middle of the spectrum. So I started first with the graded wash of blue, and now I'm adding another graded wash of purple or pink. And you will see the final result, which will look really beautiful. The last technique we are going to try on this paper sheet is lifting color. This is very useful technique when you want to get some highlights from your painting by lifting up some pigments out of the painted area. So I'm creating a flat wash first, and then we'll need to wait for it to dry a little bit so it won't be like semi-dry, and after that we will need to use a clean brush. You put some water in the brush and then you lift up some pigments out of the paper. I also have a brush designed for this technique. If the paper is too wet, this technique will not work, so you will need to practice to know when is the right time to lift the color. We already went through 10 techniques, but I promise the next 10 ones are even more fun and magical, so I hope you can stay with me until the end of the tutorial. If you like this video so far, subscribe and hit the bell button, as it's a huge support for my channel. Thank you! Welcome back and thank you for keeping watching. I'm going to show you how to do the scratch off technique. I use a palette knife, but you can use any sharp tools you have, such as a needle. So this technique will add more texture or highlights to your work. So first we will need to create a flat wash, and I try to create a very thick layer of colors. So later on when we scratch off the pigments, then it will show the white color from the paper. Now we have a beautiful flat wash of blue, and we will need to wait for it to dry a little bit before we scratch off the pigments. So I used the palette knife to just scratch some pigments, and I didn't use too much force, so the paper is not damaged. The next technique is called pulling color. Pulling color or dragging color is a technique in watercolor painting. To use this technique, we will paint a brushstroke or two with a lot of pigments on dry paper. And then we will use a wet brush to paint next to it, so the pigments will be dragged along with the new brush strokes. We are moving on to one of my favorite techniques in watercolor painting. I found it so powerful and useful when I want to paint a complicated painting, such as landscape or portrait. So the negative painting technique involves painting negative space around an object to create its shape. This technique can bring more depth to your watercolor artwork. To do this technique, you will need to wait for each layer to dry completely before painting the next one. I created another video about creating a painting, a very simple painting but very beautiful one with the negative painting technique. I will leave the link into the top of this video so you can check it out. The next technique we are going to learn is blooming. So blooming allows you to create a beautiful and natural gradient of colors. To use the blooming in watercolor, you need to load your brush with a thin color that has a lot of water in it, and then paint it on the dry paper. When it is semi-dry, load another color and paint next to the first layer, so the water helps the pigments bleed into each other. There are different ways to create texture for your work, and using tissue paper is one of that. You can crease the tissue paper and use it to absorb some wet paint from the paper. I use this technique to create the foggy effect for this winter forest painting. I will add the link to the top of this video so you can check it out how I painted it. I'm creating a thick layer of colors with blue colors, and then use a tissue paper to absorb some pigments out of the paper when the paper is still wet. Using a sponge to paint can be very interesting, and it is very simple to use, but the texture is amazing. So you can grab a sponge that has some texture on it and pick some moist paint and apply it to the dry surface of paper. Now we will try with rubbing alcohol. Rubbing alcohol can be used in watercolor to create fascinating effects. And to use this technique, you will need to paint on your paper a layer of wet paint with a lot of pigments in it. And then you will drop alcohol to the wet paint just randomly, and then allow the alcohol to create its magic. You can see that the alcohol is spreading and creating very unique patterns. It's just so beautiful, right? Ta-da! Do you know what it is? It's salt. It's the salt crystals. So we are going to use them to create more texture for our painting. So this salt technique can be used when you paint a dark sky with stars or snow with the glitters. And you just put the salt on top of the wet paint and then let the paper dry completely. And after that, you will remove the salt out, and the salt will leave the marks on the paper, the beautiful texture and glitters on the paper. We just have 2 techniques left to try, and this one has so much fun. We will use the dish soap to create more beautiful patterns on our painting. This is one of the reasons why I love watercolor painting, because we can try different materials in our daily lives and to create many different patterns and effects. So this technique is as same as the other two. You will create a flat wash of very thick color, and then you will drop diluted dissolve on wet paint. And it looks like magic now when you can see it looks similar to flowers blooming on the paper. Alright, this one will be the last technique today. It's called dripping. So this technique uses gravity to create an interesting dripping effect. You need to keep your paper inclined so the paint can drip downwards. Remember to load your brush with a lot of water to make it work. I hope you still remember the masking technique introduced earlier in this video. So now I have my two big paintings done and the paper is 100% dry. I'm gonna remove the tape carefully, and then you will need to do this one when you use the masking tape for your painting. If you're still watching until now, I want to say thank you a lot for your time and patience. We have tried 20 different watercolor techniques, and let's look back at the different effects they created. Which one are your favorites? Let me know in the comments. I hope this experiment helps you when creating the new artwork later on. If you find the video helpful, please like, share and subscribe to my channel. It won't take you a few seconds, but it helps this video reach more people who are also learning watercolor. If you have any suggestions on the topics or how to improve the quality of the videos, please let me know in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!